Madam President.
Senator from Louisiana.
Madam President, I'd like to speak to the coronavirus and more importantly about the Senate's...
Oh, the Senate isn't a quorum call.
I apologize. May the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Madam President, I would like to speak to the coronavirus, more specifically the Senate's response to the coronavirus, or shall I say, apparently the absence of a response. Madam President, I am a doctor. And one of the most exciting things that they often show in a TV show is when there's an emergency. There's a car wreck, somebody's heart stops beating, somebody faints, something like that. And every resource is brought. I've been in that situation, and when it occurs, there's someone who might be called, runs the show, if you will, the captain of the ship, and begins to say, you must do this, you must do that. At that point, nicety does not matter. Orders are given, you respond, and things are done. And that's because there is not a moment to be lost. And I think I bring that sense of urgency to this situation. Our presiding officer is in the military, a combat pilot. She knows quite well, sometimes minutes matter. Sometimes minutes matter. I would argue that sometime is now. Now, Madam President, I've been staying away from grocery stores, et cetera, and eating through my frozen food, stuff in the fridge. But somebody told me they went to the grocery store, and businesses that had been in business last week are now boarded up. I'm having calls regularly with small business owners back in Louisiana, and they are so worried about cash flow, trying to keep people on. Some have already laid folks off, wondering what they can do. The uncertainty is destroying their livelihood. And if their livelihood of a small businesswoman is destroyed, so is the livelihood of everyone whom she employs. There is a sense of urgency that everyone in the nation should feel, but is not being acted upon now. Now, let's describe the situation, because what I actually think is I've tried to understand why that urgency is not here. It is not a general lack of urgency. It is a specific lack of urgency of the Speaker of the House and the minority leader in the Senate, the minority leader being the senior senator from New York. It is a specific lack of urgency in which they attempt to leverage the misery of the American people so that they can achieve their political goal. And I've thought deeply about that political goal. In fact, I've noticed whenever something is said by the minority leader, the senior senator from New York, I have to think, oh, it's opposite day, like my children will say. There's actually something opposite being said. Let me just figure out what that opposite thing is. So let's go through where we are, and then we'll come through the opposite day aspect of our conversations. First, people are hurting, but not just people being laid off. Schools have been discharged. My wife co-founded a school for children with dyslexia. Public charter school, children of all backgrounds come and have their dyslexia addressed. It is critical that those children be in school. There is a science-based way for those kids to learn how to read. And if they have to be dismissed because of fear about spreading disease, then those children are not being exposed to that science-based curriculum. And those children are therefore losing the opportunity to both learn and to have their issue of dyslexia addressed. That's just one school. There are very many more. So to address that, last week, the Senate Majority Leader put together a proposal where he would have senators from the Republican Party draft some initial concepts, clearly not written in stone, clearly open to negotiation, and then meet with Democratic counterparts to come up with a bipartisan solution that would reflect the perspectives of all 100 senators, knowing that each senator represents a different constituency elected by people with a different viewpoint, but the amalgamation of those viewpoints and constituencies would come up with a wise public policy that would help to address both the medical crisis and the economic crisis. It was bipartisan. And I was struck. One of our Democratic colleagues was on a show, was asked about the process, and he said, it actually worked well. I met with the small business people. I met with this senator from the Democratic side and from this senator from the Republican side, and we had a process that worked. It worked very well on the member level. It is in the leadership that it broke down. That's interesting. In the leadership, the bipartisan process with a product that both sides had agreed upon broke down. Now, Madam President, let's contrast this bipartisan process, which led to a series of policies, with the opposite day rhetoric that has been used by the Senate Minority Leader. The bipartisan product came up with an economic stabilization fund in which dollars would be transferred to the Treasury Department, which would then be transferred to the Federal Reserve to set up guaranteed loans so that an industry, not a specific business, an industry, think tourist industry, think healthcare, somebody particularly affected by the coronavirus epidemic, as a class would be able to come and get guaranteed loans to keep their people employed, to keep their business going, so that when we get through this rough patch, their business can restart as before. Now, the opposite day rhetoric of the Senate Minority Leader is that this is a bailout for big corporations, and it was a sweetheart deal put together by Republicans. Opposite day. It was actually a bipartisan deal that goes through the Federal Reserve in a way that is sector-specific but not business-specific, with the goal of keeping people employed. But the opposite day rhetoric is that it's a bailout. These are loans, specifically loans, that have to be paid back. By law, the Federal Reserve cannot take a loss. Madam President, that is not a bailout. That is a loan to keep people employed, and it's wise public policy brought together on a bipartisan basis, bipartisan Democrats and Republicans, that come up with a solution reflecting all viewpoints across the country. So despite the opposite day rhetoric of somebody who wishes to disparage, who wishes to diminish, who wishes to depreciate a process that worked as the Senate is supposed to work, Madam President, instead, it was denigrated. I kept asking myself, why? Why? We'll come to that in a little bit. What else about the opposite day process? That not enough is spent on health care. Madam President, I'm a doctor. I went through these provisions for health care. We are spending literally tens of billions of dollars on health care, trying to find where to use it best. The opposite day rhetoric that we're not. Didn't quite figure that one out. That we're not spending on the average American. Madam President, opposite day rhetoric. $1,200 to an individual, $2,400 to a couple. That just goes out the door. Those folks get it. That is a commitment. Also committed to keeping small businesses afloat with an expedited process by which that small business can obtain cash and a loan, and that loan, the portion of which is used to keep people employed, is forgiven. Forgiven, Madam President. So if I was a restaurant owner and I borrowed $100,000 and I use $75,000 of it to keep my employees employed, that $75,000 is forgiven, and I only have to pay back $25,000. Madam President, that is a bipartisan policy put together specifically to keep Americans employed with their benefits. By the way, if you were a waitress or a waiter, your tips were included in your salary. And so even though you might get a smaller amount, you make it up on tips, we took that into account with this bipartisan legislation. Bipartisan legislation that addressed that need. Opposite day, the Senate Minority Leader's rhetoric was that we weren't taking care of people. Why would he not tell the truth? Why would he specifically attempt to fool the American people about what was actually being done? I had to think about that, Madam President. Why would he attempt to corrupt the entire process? to tell the American people something which is not true. Not sure about that, Madam President. Not sure about that. So we got the deal put up by the Speaker of the House, in which she said in exchange for the airlines being able to continue to employ flight attendants and pilots and ground crew and administrators, they would have to do an emission profile for every airplane. I'm struggling to stay afloat. I have no passengers. My cash flow is immediately interrupted, but by the way, let me go out and get an emissions profile for my airplane, or else otherwise I don't get to stay in business. That is so absurd that I kept thinking that cannot be the answer. That is so stupid. Madam President, how can you label it anything else in this circumstance when people are in the process of boarding up their businesses, that is the nonsense you would propose? So I kept thinking, why would they want that, Madam President, when American people are hurting, and just like in a military emergency, and just like in a medical emergency, it demands rapid action. I was just presiding, Madam President, just before you. And as I was about to come on, I heard on the TV somebody speaking, the senior senator from Illinois. And I got a clue. He was not speaking of the Senate working where Republicans and Democrats come together and respecting 100 different constituencies, 100 different viewpoints, on a bipartisan basis, establishing policy that works for all, taking into account that Louisiana is different than Arizona, and Arizona is different than Maine, and Maine is different than Washington State. We're all Americans, but we have different industries. And so part of this bipartisan process involving as many senators as possible was to totally reflect that which was going on. But I finally had my clue as to why the Senate Majority Leader wants this process to break down. Not to be representative of us as a whole, but rather that merely which he and the Speaker of the House can negotiate. The Democratic whip from Illinois spoke of the Four Corners process. Now, those who are watching may not know what the Four Corners are. The Four Corners are when nothing else can work. You get the Senate Majority Leader, the Senate Minority Leader, the Speaker of the House, and the Minority Leader in the House meeting with the White House, and the four of them decide on everything. There's no transparency. They'll come out with a 2,000-page bill with all kind of sweetheart deals tucked into it, totally leaving out 98 other senators, but not leaving out those stakeholders. Madam President, if you're a stakeholder and you have somebody on your speed dial as one of those four corners, you can get what you want. So in this opposite day type reality, where someone speaks of bailouts, I'm thinking, somebody wants a particular industry bailed out. Doesn't want the scrutiny of 100 senators looking at it with enough time to consider. No, they want to release the bill tonight to vote on tomorrow morning. Now the emergency kicks in. Oh, it's something we can think about. Until that deal is baked. And then we have no time to consider. And then we must vote. That's how the Four Corners process works. And suddenly it dawned on me. Remember the process, Madam President, that I spoke of in which senators from both parties came together on a bipartisan basis to come up with something that would provide a little bit of support for a lot of support for the economy? Let's talk about the airlines. In the deal that was come apart with all the senators are represented in one way or another, the deal that came together was that the airlines would get a loan but would not get free money. That's what Republicans frankly wanted. That's what the White House wanted. That was agreed to in the bipartisan arrangement before it got blown up by the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader. Madam President, you know what I'm going to be curious to see? I'm going to be curious to see, Madam President, do the airlines get free money? Not just a loan to bridge over the rough spot to keep people employed, the attendants, the pilots, and the administrators, the ground crew, et cetera, but free money. And then I'll understand opposite day. I will understand that the reason that people have been talking about corporate bailouts is because they have particular industries in which they wish to bail out. And those who speak of no transparency, again, opposite day, now we're into the four corners situation, where no one knows what is being put into that package because 98 senators have been excluded. And by the way, let me just compliment my Senate Majority Leader. He is the one who proposed the transparent process of a bipartisan set of senators putting this together. So let's just drop blame where blame should be. As my Democratic colleague said on TV, it was going pretty well until it came to leadership. Well, Madam President, we will see that bill. We'll vote on it after not having time to read it because it's been crafted in a small room with people who did not include senators of both parties from different places because they had something they wished to put in there. And Madam President, we'll find out later what those stakeholders are able to get. My stakeholders are the American people. My stakeholders, Madam President, are the ones who are boarding up their buildings right now because a bill we could have voted on Sunday is still not decided upon because somebody has a special deal in which they wish to place. Madam President, the way the Senate works is not a four corners arrangement where all the power is in the group of one or two or three or four, in which deals are released the night before and released the next day, and no one has a chance to read, but some people are taken care of. Rather, it is to be, as the Senate Majority Leader put up, where there is bipartisan agreement with an opportunity to study, to understand, to reflect upon. The American people are represented. Special interests are kept in their place. Madam President, that is the way it should be. Unfortunately, that is not where we are now. Madam President, I wish it were not opposite day, but we shall find. I yield the floor.